All right. And we are recording. Wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia Wadman. I'm the Executive Director of the Waltham Land Trust. I am really happy that we have some folks here in the room today, despite it being a gorgeously sunny day. You guys all get gold stars for coming in because this is a very important issue. And I know that we have a bunch of folks who are watching online, and I thank you for tuning in as well. We are recording this, so you can tell your friends and families afterwards that it was an amazing production and they should tune into walthamlandtrust.org at some point to see the recording, and we'll also share it other ways too. So just a few words. If you need to use the restroom, they are behind me. There are restrooms back that way, as well as filling station for your water bottles. And if you could turn off your phone or put it on do not disturb or whatever, that would be appreciated. So the Waltham Land Trust, I think you all know, is our community's primary environmental nonprofit group. But before I get into any more, I do want to thank and acknowledge the Mayor Jeanette McCarthy, who is in attendance here. Thank you, Mayor, for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you. So the Land Trust has a bunch of events throughout the year, as I think all of you know. So people who were here in person, I encourage you to bring home one of these blue sheets right off the presses with our upcoming events, which include a walk next week during Steampunk along the Charles River. If we're lucky, we'll see some birds of prey along the river because they like to live there or above it. And then the next Saturday, we have a fundraiser at the Wagon Wheel Farm Stand up on Waltham Street in Lexington, just over the line. And we get 20% if you give them one of these sheets or tell them that you're a Waltham Land Trust supporter. We get 20% of your sale. So they have tons of seedlings, delicious deli sandwiches, wonderful veggies. Great place. Go check it out. But our big event is going to be on June 3rd, which is our Blues Jam, our 19th annual Green Space Blues Jam. It is a party with music and dancing and drinks and snacks and our silent auction. Our silent auction is actually going to be online, and that'll be starting on May 31st, and that'll end on June 4th. So those are upcoming events. Definitely check them out. Most of them are on the Waltham Land Trust website, and if they're not up there now, they will be very soon. Okay, so we are really excited, although saddened, to be talking about this situation. To talk a little bit more about how Save Waltham Wildlife, which is an initiative of the Waltham Land Trust, started, I am going to invite Emily Sypik up to the front. Emily is one of our lead stewards. You probably see her along the Charles, often with a camera, and she's a very passionate birder. So Emily, if you don't mind coming up, you can tell us about the group and then introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm with the Waltham Land Trust as a lead steward along the Charles, been picking up litter and removing invasives for 17 years there, and love the birds. I love all of nature, but birds are my specialty. And so I'm glad that we all came here to try and stop the poisoning of owls, eagles, hawks, foxes, cats, and dogs. I know of a couple that were saved. Their owner got help for them in time for the dogs. And when Sonia told the stewards on the E-list about Laura Kiesel's event in Lexington, Massachusetts, 4 of us happened to attend that, and we started Save Waltham Wildlife. So we are all here today. Leslie and Linda and Alan are Alan's here, and Linda remains at the table. And we've been having Zoom meetings regularly, or sometimes in person, with Sonia, and discussing what we can do to help. This has been a problem for a long time. The National Audubon Society did an article about rodenticide 10 years ago. At that point, I had never even heard of the word. So, you know, it's beyond time that we really do something to rectify the situation. And now we'll introduce Laura Kiesel. And Laura holds a graduate degree in natural resources and conservation biology, and has worked for many years as a wildlife advocate and environmental journalist. Her articles and op-eds on this issue have been featured in Dig Boston, the Boston Globe, Salon, and one feature was a finalist for the David Carr Award for Investigative Journalism. She has also been interviewed by many outlets on this topic, including Boston.com, the Boston Herald, and Channel 5 WCVB News. She is the founder of Save Arlington Wildlife, and the initiative for us starting to Save Waltham Wildlife is that if anyone is interested, we do have an email, Save Waltham Wildlife, if you would like to join or contribute in any way. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Waltham Land Trust for inviting me here today. And thank you for coming in, even though it is a gorgeous day after nearly a week of like gloomy, chilly weather. So as was stated in my introduction, my graduate degree is in natural resources, sciences and management and conservation biology. But my first degree was in literature and journalism. And so I've sort of combined those two skills over the years, often covering environmental topics as a journalist. And I am somewhat sheepish to say that up until a few years ago, I had never read, despite my background, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring cover to cover. I had read excerpts of it, and I just really read it in full a year and a half ago. And I was stunned by how much of it was relevant to this topic. So I just wanted to start off with this quote: "The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can only do so when in possession of the facts." Because I feel like a lot of the facts about this topic aren't yet known in the public. And I want to start through these presentations and my reporting, shedding a light on this issue. So I first became interested in this issue. I lived in an affordable housing complex in 2015, and I walked out one day and there were 20 bait stations being put down with these rodenticides in them. I was the only one who understood what was in them. My landlord didn't know. And when I tried to explain that this could harm wildlife, the pest control professional said, despite my degree, that I didn't know what I was talking about. So I then started reporting about it. This was my first feature in 2018 in Dig Boston. And then I followed that up with a sequel piece that was also in Dig Boston and then syndicated in Salon, that unfortunately, the issue had escalated a lot since 2018 to 2021 with several bald eagle deaths. And that was where I took this article, kind of was the springboard for that. So I just want to back up and let you know that there are many different types of rodenticides, but the one that I will be concentrating on for this presentation are anticoagulant rodenticides. These are rodenticides that stop the blood from clotting. There's first generation anticoagulant rodenticides. Those are like the warfarins. And starting in the 90s, because rats actually can build resistance to these rodenticides in only like a few years because they breed so rapidly. Scientists then created a second generation anticoagulant rodenticide class, and that is like a super poison. And unlike the first generations, they can get a lethal dose within one feeding, but it doesn't kill them for a week, so they can continually feed. So by the time a predator eats them, they've already got like a heavy load of toxins that can go up the food chain. And also this is just a list to show you that it's not just ingestion that can cause toxic byproducts in a person or an animal. Inhalation if these things catch on fire, dermal if they get on the skin. So the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides are extremely toxic, even by rodenticide standards. So to go back to Silent Spring, which really discussed pesticides, insecticides, and DDT, one of the species that was most impacted were bald eagles. By 1970, they were basically extirpated in Massachusetts and most of the nation. And it took about a decade really since the publication of Silent Spring, but DDT was eventually banned in 1972. The Endangered Species Act was created and bald eagles were listed, but just to really show how long it took for bald eagles to recover, as of 2007, they were still nationally endangered. And as of only a decade ago, they were still endangered here in Massachusetts. They were actually still threatened around 2020 and 2021 here in Massachusetts, because there's a state list as well as a national list. And they had just been demoted to species of special concern around 2020, 2021, when then our bald eagles started dying, at least that were reported. So this is the eagle that died in 2021 spring here in Waltham. That was a picture of her that was taken only a few weeks before she died. On the left, that's a photo courtesy of a friend of mine, Margaret Lewis. And there is a picture. She just happened to be walking by when the bald eagle was removed from her nest, dead, and she was on top of her unhatched eggs. And there was another picture she had, but I didn't want to squeeze it into the frame of her with her mate. Bald eagles do mate for life. But just to back up a little bit, that wasn't even the first bald eagle death that I had heard about. It was the first one formally counted by Massachusetts, but this is a picture from one that was found on Cape Cod in 2018 that died of rodenticide poisoning, but for some reason it wasn't formally tallied. And then only a few months after the Waltham bald eagle, this is C25. She died in Arlington, that's where I live, and this was a picture I got of her when she was only a month or couple months old. As you can see, she looks like a character from Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal. I had never seen a nestling bald eagle before. It was such a thrill for me. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I never saw any wildlife until I left the city. And I lived in Alaska working on conservation issues, and I saw one bald eagle once, like way in the distance. And now I had a front seat view in my town to see these animals being like reared right in front of me. And this is a photo I took, that was one I think was in late May, and this was in July. You can see how much bigger she got. And this was on July 4th. I visited for the 4th of July, Independence Day. It seemed a good time to visit them again at the nest. And this was only a few weeks before she died. And I don't know if you can see there look like to be speckles of green on her feathers that I noticed in the photo. And that day she was fed a rat. I watched the mother bring the rat in, and the green actually stays in their intestinal tracts, and you can sometimes see it when they're feeding. So I didn't see that, but I noticed in this photo later on that it looks like she may have gotten some of that bait on her feathers. And I know a lot of the photographers were very concerned. And then in late July, only a few weeks after this photo was taken, this was the last photo that was taken of her alive. She had fallen onto the ground face down, and the animal control officer was called in, and she was taken to Tufts Wildlife Clinic where she died. And she was the second bald eagle formally tallied after the Waltham eagle to die. And this is again, only like not even a year after they were demoted to species of special concern. Now this is MK, the eagle. This is C25's mother. So MK and her partner, KZ, they were the first breeding bald eagles we had in Arlington in 60 years since DDT wiped them out. So there's a saying that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And I feel like we are repeating a lot of the same mistakes that we made with DDT, but with another class of chemicals. So in late February, MK was not leaving the ground. She was still there after dark, which is a bad sign. So she was brought into New England Wildlife Center, and these are the pictures. They were actually hopeful that maybe she could pull through. They had her for, I think, 48 hours. She did make it through the first night, but overnight, I think it was the second night, she actually had a mass hemorrhage. Suddenly spontaneous, and because that's how it works, right? They get a tiny cut or something, or they cough too hard, and basically a blood vessel bursts and it won't stop bleeding. And so she died. And this is not just restricted to Massachusetts. This is a nationwide issue. There was a huge study that was done just a couple of years ago that found 80% of bald and golden eagles that they were surveying across the country were found to have SGARs, which is the acronym we usually use, in their system. And so I was very upset about MK's death. I've been already very attuned to this issue. I was working on it. So I'm not going to play this now because I don't want to take up too much time. I had a rally for MK the day after she died. Hundreds of people showed up, even though it was a weekday evening and, like, as you can see, chilly, damp, slushy weather. Well over 200 people showed up, and we did a march from the green of the art museum, Sears Dallin Art Museum, to Town Hall, where I and a few other people, including Representative Sean Garbely, addressed the crowd. And I was really impressed. I think it really shows that people are starting to really understand the gravity of this issue. and want to take action. They want our legislators to do something about this on all levels, like municipal, state, and federal. Because this was 24 hours notice, and that was the response. Oops, I didn't want to play that. I just wanted to forward. Do you know how? Let's watch it. So you can see the crowd. And that was oh, did it actually, it did forward.
Yeah.
Oh, you did it. Thank you. So bald eagles are not the only species that are vulnerable. They're obviously in a precarious position because their populations are still low, but great horned owls are also very vulnerable to this. This was a family of great horned owls that were nesting in our local park in Arlington. This was the mother and the two fledglings. I had lived in Arlington for a decade at this time, and this was the first time we had great horned owls nesting that I knew about. This was one of the last photos taken of them last spring, and this was only about like 8 months after C25's death. And then it seems to be stuck. Oh, so that's the mother and the first fledgling were found dead last spring. We couldn't find them on the nest, and people were looking, and they finally found them in this corner. And this photo was taken, I think, by animal control or the wildlife rehabbers who showed up right before they were taken away. And so like I said, similar to eagles, a lot of these birds of prey do mate for life. They will not find another mate until their other mate dies. This is the male owl, and he was widowed. And so we used to go after his whole family died. So there was also a third fledgling that was found dead only 3 or 4 days after those, the mother and the first fledgling. All summer long and into early fall, we would just hear the lone male owl hooting and hooting and hooting and flying around. Like, it seemed to me, I don't want to anthropomorphize, like he was looking for his mate or his family and not understanding what happened. And then I was so excited on Thanksgiving Day, we were hiking through the woods, me and my partner, when we saw that he had a new mate. And 2 weeks after that, she was found on the ground, and she also died. So he's been twice widowed in less than a year. And she, unlike, we didn't get to do it with the first, with the mother and the two fledglings, but this owl was brought in for a formal necropsy to formally show that it was the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, because the others we didn't do it with, even though they were showing the same signs, like when you looked or cut them open, they were spilling watery blood post-mortem, which is usually a pretty telltale sign of the rodenticide. And that's a problem here in Waltham too. So this is a young owlet that was found dead in Waltham, literally, I think only 40 or 50 feet from where the eagle nest was. Within a week of the Waltham eagle dying, this owlet was found, I think, right across the river on the other side of it, fallen out of its nest halfway and showing signs of poisoning, like the leaking blood out of the mouth. And this is another owl photo that someone sent me. I actually get quite a few from Waltham, from people who are really interested in this issue, who will say, I'm just randomly coming upon dead owls on the DCR path or the Waltham, the Riverway. And someone sent me this photo of a dead great horned owl. And one of the first high profile cases that people might have heard of in 2015 was Ruby the red-tailed hawk, which was in Fresh Pond. And that was in 2015. And I actually go by there quite a bit, and there's still rodenticide all over that same building where that nest is. And Tufts Wildlife Clinic is actually the leading authority in this country for this issue. Dr. Maureen Murray is her name. And this was a study she did a few years back that found 96% of the birds of prey that she tested were exposed to eschars. And that included 100% of the red-tailed hawks, is sort of, I think, a subset of that study. And this has gone up 10% in only like 6 or 7 years. She did another study where it was 86% were exposed. So now it's 96% of those birds surveyed had eschars in their system. And it's not just wildlife. Birds of prey are probably bear the biggest brunt of this issue, but other wildlife, coyotes, foxes, but pets as well, cats and dogs. The MSPCA, which I interviewed for my first article, and I've been keeping touch with their updates on this, they report seeing dozens of cases of rodenticide poisoning annually in cats and dogs. The cases tend to peak in spring and fall, which also is when people tend to use more rat poison. And the average veterinary cost is, it got cut off by the photo, but $2,000 for treatment if they can be saved, if it's found in time. That's a picture of my cat Samson, which did catch a mouse in my apartment. And luckily I got it from him before he could eat it because there was a lot of bait stations in my building. And the landlord did tell me if he got sick, they're not going to pay for it. It's of course my burden. So, you know, a lot of tenants are being disproportionately burdened with this as well. But I want to say that this issue actually came to the EPA's attention, not over animals at all. These were first allowed in over-the-counter sales in brick and mortar stores for years. And they were poisoning between 10 and 20,000 children every year. These were disproportionately low-income children, and often low-income children of color. So this was an environmental justice issue. So this was actually part of a two-part series that initially was in Environmental Health News, and it was syndicated in Scientific America. So in response to that, in 2008, the US EPA finally started to move that they were going to phase these out from over-the-counter sales. And the manufacturers of DECON and the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a conservative coalition, basically balked, and there was like a lengthy legal battle that went on for almost 8 years. And I want to say that ALEC actually released a press release saying that that amount of children that were getting poisoned every year was an acceptable risk. Just to let you understand a little bit of the mindset of the manufacturers of these poisons. So if children are not even persuading them to do tougher regulations, I'm not really sure if animals will as well. So in 2014, they finally came to a legal settlement where they decided to take the eSCARs off over-the-counter shelves. I think they had a couple of years to sell out their existing inventories like hardware stores. So you might have still seen them until about 2017 or 18. But the problem is the EPA still allows licensed pest control operators to market and use these poisons in what they call tamper-resistant bait stations that are applied or distributed by a licensed pest control professional. So it's still allowed that way. And there are a few problems with that. One is there seems to be a loophole and no regulation of the internet. So even though you may not be able to find these in brick and mortar stores, you can go on Amazon and still get a giant vat of like Brotaphacum, and on Amazon or a number of other like online stores, no problem. And this article was in National Audubon magazine, and the author is from Massachusetts. So he was getting them shipped to stores or picking them up in Massachusetts or getting them shipped to his house. And since this regulation, which was mostly geared not toward animals, but to reduce child poisonings of eSCARs have declined, but they have not been eliminated. I still don't think this is an acceptable risk. So children can still get these in their system, even with the bait stations. But FGARs, which are still available over the counter, the child poisonings have increased 60 to 80%. So it seems like it's just sort of, the FGARs are now replacing it as the #1 rodenticide poisoning of children. And I want to say again, I mentioned I lived in an affordable housing complex. I used to see the young children in my complex all the time, sticking their hands into these bait stations, playing with them. And I would mention all the time to the landlords, I was very concerned that if there's residue, you know, when the rats run out of them, they scatter the bait, that they could get sick. And a lot of the parents, usually I would have to tell them what was in the bait stations. They didn't know what they usually thought it was like some kind of trap that trapped the rat inside. The other problem is these tamper-resistant bait stations, they're not tamper-proof, they're tamper-resistant. I regularly see them broken open. This was a bait station in Arlington Heights that was feet away from our local Petco, where there was a puppy training class that they took them outside. The puppies were only a few inches, as you can see, the bait is exposed there. And one puppy went over and sniffed, and I like had to say something like, please don't let the puppies near that. And I did get a town official to remove that bait station, but I see them broken open regularly. In fact, squirrels are known to break them open and spread the bait. This also happened in Arlington, and someone took a picture of the squirrels had gotten into the bait. You can see in that further left-hand corner picture that the squirrel has it in his mouth, and he had spread it to his nest. And a few days later, about 4 or 5 days later, they all started dropping dead out of the trees. And the animal control officer had to come get them because they too could get scavenged. So these bait stations are not that tamper-proof. And finally, the other big problem is this does nothing to address secondary poisoning. So even if the bait station isn't broken open, the rats or mice go in, they feed on this bait, and then they leave, where then they get eaten by a hawk or an owl or a coyote or someone's cat or dog. So this was a red-tailed hawk that I watched in my neighborhood for about an hour, and then I finally saw that it was stalking something. And just to clarify, it jumped on this tree and then it jumped on the ground. There's a bait station right there, and there was a mouse coming out of it at the time. And just as I was trying to deliberate, like, I don't want to interfere with natural, like, hunting behavior of wildlife, but I don't want it to get a poison mouse. Someone did come out of that building and scared it away. So luckily I didn't have to intervene either way, and then it flew off. But I regularly see wildlife stalking rats or mice near these areas where there are bait stations, and even as the rodents are exiting the bait stations. And the EPA is very aware of the data of the harms of these. Every 2 years or so, they conduct something that's called an ecological risk assessment. This is from the 2020 report. It was the most recent at the time I originally compiled this. Now there's a 2022 report, but this was their conclusion, that the nature of risk to mammals and birds from anticoagulant rodenticides is well established and includes mortality from both primary and secondary exposure, as well as chronic growth and reproduction effects. So to that last part of the quote, I'm mostly even just talking about the lethal impacts, but we don't even fully understand how this might be adversely impacting the reproduction of these animals, the long-term health consequences for those that even survive and don't die, but may have weakened immune systems. They may not be reproducing as regularly. And so from 1975 to about 2020, they've counted 700 poisonings of wildlife, the EPA formally, which even so, first I just want to point out that even with that woefully inadequate number that doesn't really reflect the genuine numbers of what is happening, they still thought it was a really severe problem. But this was sort of the breakdown. As you can see, great horned owls, red-tailed hawks are some of the more vulnerable. But some of the other numbers also show how inadequate this data is. So for instance, they say only 4 barred owls have been formally died of this poison since 1975. New England Wildlife Center, when I showed them that, they're like, we've had 40 barred owls with anticoagulant poisoning, many who have died just in the past year. So it just shows the huge discrepancy between the data that the EPA is relying on and what the experiences are on the ground of the wildlife rehabilitators. So New England Wildlife Centers, which are the same centers that treated MK when she passed, when I did my article in 2021, they told me that they see about 100 to 200 cases per year of anticoagulant poisonings. They treat all wildlife species as well as birds of prey. They said though they see it across species, birds of prey do get the most poisoning incidences. And just see, this is one wildlife center in one part of the state sees 100 to 200 cases a year. And just extrapolate that on the state or national level. And they've also noticed in the past few years that the patients are taking much longer to recover and they're requiring a lot more treatment. So this was a great horned owlet that was in Cape Cod. It's in this owlet didn't make it. He died, as you can see, he's covered in blood. I'm sorry if that, I don't mean to sort of like should have come with a content warning, but this poor owlet didn't make it. He even had a blood transfusion from an ambassador owl that they have there. He still couldn't make it. His sister did, but it took 9 months of vitamin K infusions daily before the owlet's blood would clot on its own. And they've never experienced that kind of stay. So even when they're surviving, it's taking a lot. And these wildlife rehabilitation clinics, they're working on shoestring budgets. They're not getting paid. They're not getting funded by the government. So part of the problem is that I found out, and I mean, I had this experience anecdotally, but I was surprised that it wasn't even, there wasn't even a law about this, is that pest control professionals, there's no law mandating that they have to tell the truth about these impacts. As I stated, in the beginning of this, when I first mentioned it to my landlord and he brought it to the pest control professional, they said I didn't know what I was talking about. That I heard recently one told me that there has not been a single wildlife death in Massachusetts in the past year. This was before MK. So this is what they tell people, and it makes it very hard sometimes to compete with. When I go to a store and I tell a store that this can harm the wildlife in the area, it can kill like someone's dog or cat, they'll ask their pest control professional, and then they come back to me and say, they say it's harmless, or they'll say that it's very rare. and it only happens. And so it's hard to compete with that because they're seen as the professionals and the experts, and it's usually assumed there should be some kind of law that stops them from deceiving the public, but there's not. And the landlords and businesses also do not have to disclose what chemicals they're using. So tenants don't know, right? As like I mentioned with that young child sticking her hand into the bait station. My landlord didn't have to disclose what chemicals they were to them. The National Pest Management Association is kind of like the large lobbying arm of the pest control industry. This was on their website until 2 weeks ago when I called it out on my Facebook page, and then they took it down. But this was their quote on the top of like their page of their mission statement, that it is to counteract activist efforts on both the national and local levels by being prepared to instantly respond on behalf of the industry. So they are a very polished, well-oiled lobbying machine. I used to work back in the day in my 20s on Capitol Hill doing climate change advocacy, and it reminds me a lot of the fossil fuel lobby, to be honest. This was in Connecticut just a few weeks ago. This was a bald eagle. As you can see, they get these neurological impacts with rodenticide poisoning where their head tilts. He died, and at the same time that this was happening, Connecticut was actually considering on the state level an all-out ban of these eschars, and the pest control industry, in the same article where this photo was featured, had a whole, had like several quotes by several different professionals where they were saying like, we're gonna have Ratmageddon if you give up eschars. And so the politicians at the last minute backtracked. And so right now it's on the back burner whether they'll consider a ban. So they're very responsive when they see legislation coming down the pipe. I don't know if this will play. This is a young rat that I came upon on Massachusetts Avenue in my neighborhood, Capitol Square section of Arlington, which is where the movie theater is, in the middle of the day with high foot traffic. It was about 4 p.m. on an August day. There were little children walking by. And I took this video for a few reasons. One, I've actually seen this a lot. I want to say before poison became ubiquitous in my neighborhood, which actually did not happen until that 2015 time when it was banned from over the counter. I had never seen a rat in Arlington. It took about a year or 8 months after poison was put down everywhere. Suddenly we had a rat problem. But people often argue rats are a public health issue. That's why we need these poisons. But what these poisons encourage is when the rats get sick, they're more likely to go out in areas that are heavily circulated by the public. So they're more likely to come into contact with people and transmit diseases. And as you can see, this is poor rat is suffering pretty badly. I think it's pretty inhumane for any animal to have to die like this. Even a rat or mouse should not have to suffer. But obviously also to illustrate, a mouse or a rat in this condition makes a very easy meal for a young hawk or owl that is just learning to hunt. They're just learning to hunt, and here's this very easy meal. So of course they're going to scoop this up. So in some ways they're almost more likely, especially again, a young owl or hawk or a mother that's hunting for nestlings where she's has a much higher load of diet that she has to give them. It's much more likely to scoop that up. And a 2021 study did find that the rats that had ingested the anticoagulant rodenticides were significantly more likely to have leptospirosis, I think it's called, than the rats that did not have AR in their system. So again, showing that this actually can compound or exacerbate issues of transmission. If we're worried about rats transmitting diseases to humans, those that have these poisons are more likely to do so, both because it lowers their immune system and because it makes them more likely to act in ways that they're coming into contact with people. And I don't know if I want to get into this a lot today, but I think it's important. So I mentioned my background was in wildlife biology, and I was studying to be a wolf biologist. And I think we're all very aware of the stigma that wolves have had in this country. And here in the East, I don't know if it's as prevalent to understand, but I did do, like I said, work in Alaska. And it was like the only good wolf is a dead wolf. And there's still aerial hunting and poisoning programs. So I'm very attuned to this idea of how the stigma of certain species really sometimes lead to this mass destruction of the environment because we're so scared or hateful of a species. And I understand people might have more affinity for the idea of a wolf than a rat, but I still think we need to think about this stigma because I think it plays a lot into what we're doing here. So again, usually there's a concern about disease transmission, which I've already discussed is more likely to happen with these poisonings. Always, 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 the pest control industry brings up the plague. They did at a talk that I did in Arlington when we were actually going to pass, which we did at town warrant. They came on and spoke about the plague. I did an op-ed where I was opposite of the president of the New England Pest Management Association. He talked about the plague for a paragraph. Rats and mice are not, rats have now been disproven to be the origin of the plague, but I just think it's important to show that there's that just deep-seated hatred and fear that's getting played on. Concern over property damage and causing fires, and that is a valid concern. I just want to say we want to be careful when we're thinking about that. And of course, similar to wolves, there's all these lores and folk tales depicting rats as evil and filthy. And also just, I mean, we do associate them with poverty. And I want people to also think about that. I actually saw this discussion being advertised. Well, actually, I saw a discussion about rats, and some people did mention this talk here in Waltham, and several people were making jokes. I hope those rats don't want affordable housing next, or this isn't a third world country. We're becoming a third world country. So there is a lot of stigma that this also arises out of that we should just really think about when we consider how we're approaching the management of rodents. And again, these are some of the studies that showed that it was gerbils and not rats that actually probably pushed plagues in the Middle Ages, as it actually was human fleas and not those that actually infest rats. So that's just, I just put that there to illustrate that with a lot of this overhype does come misinformation. But we are noticing more rats nowadays. So there is several reasons. Climate change is one. Rats used to not breed year round, and now they do because of the warmer winters. There's the increased population density, which is why we might be noticing them in the Boston metro area. More people is going to equal more trash, which is going to equal more rats. Development and construction doesn't necessarily increase rodent populations, but it's going to increase their visibility because it's going to make them move around more as you're interrupting their dens. And same reason for urbanization along with construction. Anytime you get more people, you're going to get more rats. The pandemic did sometimes make rats and mice migrate more into the suburbs when the restaurants were closed. So there was that bit of a migration happening. And ironically, I want to say, I do think the poison is part of the reason we're seeing more rats. When you're leaving poison out, you are leaving a food source out for them 24/7. And they are going, and they can build resistance to those in a few generations, which for them is a few years. And their predators can't build resistance to those poisons. And then so you're eradicating their predators, which in the absence of their predators, the prey populations are going to artificially explode or inflate. So you're making the problem worse. When I was doing my article, when I was doing research for my article in 2021, I was actually shocked, despite the fact that I obviously am biased on this issue. I still thought I would find some studies about showing that there was some efficacy of anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning, like poisons for controlling rats. And I could not find a single study that showed that these poisons reduce rodents in urban or suburban ecosystems, or actually really anywhere other than small islands, very small tropical islands, which is not translatable to here. And even that was short-lived, and they had a lot of caveats that, you know, there could be rebound effects, but I could not find any studies showing that they actually reduce population. So when I again say we really should be approaching this from a scientific standpoint as well, we should ask ourselves, why are we investing so much in poisons that have no studies that support their efficacy? And also what data does exist shows that rodents have actually increased in the Boston metro area, or at least the sightings have significantly, in tandem with the rapid rise of anticoagulant rodenticides. Now, does that mean the poison is causing the increase? Again, I don't know about that. I have reasons to believe it could be at least a contributing factor. You know, causality is not always, correlation is not always the same as causality, as they say, but I still think it shows at the least that this is not an effective way to control rodents. And so this is basically reiterating some of what I said, that it lures rodents to the area, they can build resistance. But rats are also very smart, and they will actually teach each other to avoid poisons. They'll say, don't use that, to their other like family members, so they can develop something called Bates shyness, which is why like every few years, the industry tries to come up with new bait stations or new looking traps because they can outsmart it and they can outbreed the poison. And this is actually a quote from a humane wildlife control officer about how poison bait station is basically an attractant as much as any other food source. And I just want to also mention, so I said before, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I never actually saw rats growing up, despite growing up in what would be called a so-called inner city neighborhood. I did see mice, but I hardly ever saw a rat growing up. We did have a lot of alley cats back then, and in my neighborhood where my brother still lives, they've gotten rid of all the alley cats. But I want to say, if we're saying we have to absolutely eradicate rats, we're going to lose because rats are not going away. I understand that we do need to reduce their populations, but when people say, how do we get rid of them? I am very wary because that's going to be a losing battle. They can have like 1,500, a single pair can have at least 1,500 babies a year. There's just no way to absolutely eradicate them. But I want to say, nor should we try, because again, they are an important staple of a lot of our wildlife species diets. Birds of prey, obviously, coyotes and foxes, but even some other species people don't realize, like skunks, raccoons, possums, even like crows and weasels. And a lot of people are really surprised that herons and great blue herons feed on rats. They do supplementally. I mean, they're mostly fishers. But if we don't want to completely take away from this in an urban area, like our urban wildlife does need rats and mice to feed on to supplement their diet. And they do scavenge trash and aid in seed dispersal too. So they do play a role as well. So we might want to consider that. Really the best way to manage rodents, and people sometimes say that, you know, this is a complicated issue, or maybe it's people aren't going to as easily clean up their trash, but it really is about managing our waste. Something I've noticed, anecdotally speaking again, is that sometimes when places put down poison, it almost feels like they're lazier about their dumpsters. This happened in the last building I lived in. They just put down poison, but the dumpsters were a mess and weren't cleaned up for, you know, an entire year. The recycling would have garbage in it. And so that it wasn't helping. It was just trying to slap a Band-Aid on the problem without addressing the root cause. Even small, low-hanging fruit actions like getting rid of bird feeders most of the year. I love birds. I'm a avid birder, but most of the year the birds do not need supplemental feeding of seeds. In the winter, maybe it helps to feed them, but the rest of the year they have a natural diet that they can use. So as much as I love the birds, I don't feed them throughout most of the year because those bird feeders are an attractant. When I lived in Alaska, they were not allowed to put up bird feeders because it was an attractant to grizzly bears. So I think we have to start thinking about what we're attracting here. And if you do use a bird feeder, please take it in overnight and consider feeders like suets rather than ones that spill seeds. You know, rinsing out your cyclables, keeping your compost indoors if possible until you're taking it out, because that can also be an attractant. Picking up pet waste, taking the trash out when it's right about to be picked up and not overnight or days before. And emphasizing on exclusion, so making sure your house is not as porous, making sure all the holes and entryways can be filled up, which is a lot of what problem animal control agents work on. On a larger level, if it's not just like, well, what can I do to reduce rodents, but what can I do to really start raising awareness on this issue? Here are just some of the things we've done. We started a poison-free pledge campaign that businesses in Arlington can sign up for, and they get a little placard and we boost them on our website and social media. Sometimes they can't sign up even if they want to because their landlords that they own the retail space do, but we're at least trying to get awareness out there and showing businesses that this is a good thing who do have the agency to make that choice. Even though the state does not allow municipalities like Waltham or Arlington to ban on private properties these poisons, they can ban them on public property. So Arlington did pass a ban and banned these rodenticides on all public property, so all town-owned and managed lands. And Waltham could do the same. When I was researching my article, I did actually do quite a bit of research into Waltham. It was one of Arlington, Waltham, and one other city were the ones I was mostly looking at. This was in 2021. I was shocked that Stonehurst actually had poisoned bait stations and they're in the woods. But I will say to their credit, when I called and she found out that that's what was in them, like that, she changed to snap traps, and she even changed the label so people knew that they were now using snap traps. But I know some of the other public lands, at least at the time, I think this has changed in 2021 of Waltham, they were using it in other parks and conservation lands. But you can have a citywide ordinance to ban it. You can, similar to Arlington, we've submitted a home rule petition to the state, which will be voted on in committee soon, to ask for a waiver to the state preemption law, it's called, so that we can ban it on private property as well, because again, we're losing our bald eagles. That, you know, our argument is that we're disproportionately losing a lot of our vulnerable species. You can talk with your local board of health to see, I think it usually should be under their management. I know it is in Arlington, to see if you can talk with them about not requiring SGARs in the construction of new development during the, it's called usually the pre-demolition phase. In Arlington, I did a public records request, and 30 out of 32 of the construction projects that they had allowed in 2021 had SGARs on their property, like had SGARs. Waltham had a similar number. And so, but I will say Arlington, when I pressured them, they stopped requiring not just SGARs, but bait stations, which usually incentivize the SGARs. So now anytime we have a construction project, there's no SGARs allowed. So that's another thing people can do. And you can urge your local housing authority to ban anticoagulant rodenticides. Again, this doesn't just disproportionately impact wildlife and pets, but young children and usually low-income children. So the demographics that are likely to live in these housing authority buildings. And our Arlington Housing Authority also did respond to pressure to please stop using them. So they phased them out. And to push for a municipal integrated pest management plan. So it's not just about taking the SGARs away, but really looking at other options that are more holistic. Just really quick, that's our poison-free pledge banner that's on different business windows. So now it's nice to walk down an entire block that has that in there, and people, it starts a conversation too. Somerville did a lot of interesting things. In my 2018 article, I looked into them as sort of a model for IPM. They gave a rat-resistant trash toters to every household. They required licensing and inspection of dumpsters, which, and I think they did every 6 months, like an inspection, and to make sure that businesses and big buildings were keeping their dumpsters clean. They did a ContraPest pilot. So ContraPest is a fertility drug in a bait that the rats or mice can eat. It doesn't completely sterilize them, but it like halves their fertility. So it drastically reduces the number of litters they have. And it did reduce rats at the time in their test pilot areas by 57% and 67% respectively. And unlike the SGARs, it doesn't move up the food chain. It metabolizes within, I think, minutes of ingestion, and it doesn't bioaccumulate in the body. And some places are now, Somerville is doing high volume electronic traps, and they also did an education and awareness campaign, which is similar to what we're doing now in Arlington. So that's, now they've moved on to electronic traps that can get a lot of rats, and they kind of give a database. It records it whenever it traps and electrocutes, and it's instantaneous, so it's not as cruel as poison by far. Other ideas is better signage and enforcement of wildlife feeding laws. I know in my town, and I'm guessing in Waltham, there's a big problem with feeding the waterfowl. People sometimes will come and toss entire like loaves. I one time watched a person just throw an entire loaf of bread on the ground and then leave, and then the rats come swarm it. And we do have an ordinance, and we have a sign that's this small that no one sees too. So when I do try to tell people, you know, I have to say, oh yeah, all the way over there, there's this tiny sign saying do not feed the waterfowl. So even just better signage. I know Belmont and some other places have done carry in, carry out policies for their trash where they got rid of their trash cans, so that places, there was no place for it to accumulate and attract rodents. Increase trash pickup. So instead of just once a week, maybe a couple of times a week in parks or other high volume areas where there's a lot of foot traffic and trash accumulates quickly. And more of these type of receptacles, which I know you've seen in the city, which are the big belly canisters, which are a lot more rat resistant than the open barrels. And now I just want to talk really briefly as we're getting close to the end. There's also a lot of state legislation to really pay attention to. So this one is the one here we at Save Arlington Wildlife are the most interested in. It's the local control bill. My partner actually has a t-shirt that also shows it on the back, like support local control. Yeah, I didn't need to be. So made him a little impromptu model, but basically, one of the problems is the states do not allow municipalities like Waltham or Arlington to ban or restrict not just SGARs, but any pesticide from private property. I actually don't think this is very democratic. And this bill would return the power to the municipalities so that we can ban these poisons and other ones, like ones that are harming our pollinators, from private property. Because that's actually where I think the majority of these poisons are being used, not on public property, but private property. So we are working very diligently to try to spread awareness about that bill. It is getting its joint committee hearing along with the other rodenticide bills next week. Next Wednesday, we're having a big rally starting at noon in front of the State House, and the committee hearing starts at 1 p.m. People who can't go in person can also attend on Zoom the hearing, or I think it's Microsoft Meets, and testify that way, or they can write. So we're trying to get people to write their legislators, their state rep and senator, and say, please co-sponsor this bill and the other ones that I'll get into. And to also write the committee itself and say, please pass this bill. Because the pest control industry, when I did the 2021 hearing, this was the only bill that they testified against. So obviously this is the one that they fear the most and that has the most teeth in it for SGARs or any kind of pesticide regulation. And as I said, Arlington has a home rule petition that's asking for a waiver to the state preemption so that we can ban SGARs on private property. And that's going to be heard that same day, next Wednesday, May 10th. And we even have a postcard campaign where people can go online onto Save Arlington Wildlife. You'll see on the menu, there's postcard campaign for local control is the page where you can go online to this app, and for just a few dollars, you can send a postcard to your legislator. And this is, so everything that it really needs to say is this about MK and what bill, and then you can write something on the back and make it personal for yourself. And as I said, this was actually from a recent article from the National Pest Management Association, where they were quoted also in an industry trade publication below as saying that they strongly believe that only the EPA and the state should have any regulatory rights of pesticides and not towns. So obviously this is, again, something they care a lot about, but there's a reason for that, because this agency could really help start reining in these poisons that are being used. And not only are they pushing for the state, they're actually trying to get it in the Farm Bill that the federal government can tell municipalities not to regulate these poisons. So even if the state says yes, they want the federal government to tell Waltham or Arlington, no, you can't regulate these. I don't think that that's going to happen. I think it's a stretch, but just to show that they're trying to even go over the state authority and go to national to stop localities from having any power on this. And then some of you may have already heard there's also the Hawkins bill, and that would create a digital database to track these poisons. Right now, they're not being tracked at all. And so that's really important too, so that we can have better data. And I do think there are parts of it that should be strengthened. The original iteration of the bill required the pest control professionals that they had to tell a prospective customer before they signed on that this can harm wildlife, this can harm your children, and then they had to get signed consent. The pest control industry pressured legislators to take that out. I wonder why, because again, transparency and facts are really important. I think a lot of customers would not sign up if they knew. So just to wrap up, Save Arlington Wildlife, this is basically our mission, to seed other towns and cities to do similar things to what we've done. And so there's a Save Waltham Wildlife initiative here with Waltham Land Trust. There's a Save Belmont Wildlife, and there's just a Save Winchester Wildlife just got started too. And in the city of Newton, they didn't start a Save Newton Wildlife, but they have, for this city council session, they do have a warrant that would ban second generation anticoagulant rodenticides on all public properties, as well as a home rule petition similar to Arlington's. And if we can get more municipalities submitting these home rule petitions to the state, it also may, even if it doesn't go for a vote, it might pressure the state to also start on its own deciding to let us regulate some of these poisons on private property. So basically, we try to seed these groups and help them work with them collaboratively on state level legislation, as well as what they're doing on the municipal level. And so I'm working on a shoestring budget. I'm just mostly one person. I do have volunteers who help me, including my partner, but there are some people who help a lot, but it's mostly me. So just in case people are interested, Save Arlington Wildlife does have a Patreon. We do have a place where you can buy that lovely t-shirt that you saw. And I do have a PayPal as well, if people are interested in supporting this work. And that's basically it. I'll go back to this in a second, but I know I started with the Rachel Carson quote and I wanted to end with it. So we started by saying people need to have the possession of the facts. So now that I hope you have a little bit more of the facts at your disposal, she sort of said this, I think, toward the end of the book. How can intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Yet this is precisely what we have done. We have done it, moreover, for reasons that that collapse the moment we examine them. Again, I feel like it's something that can be applied to this issue as well as it did to DDT all those decades ago. And I hope we can take some of those lessons. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Laura. We can see if anybody's got some questions here, and the mayor left.
Yeah.
She told us that she had an engagement or prior engagement. I did say, too bad you missed the question and answer part, but she did wanted to share some things, and we know that the city has been taking some steps, but we'd like to encourage them to take stronger steps and more of them. But before we get into that, does anyone here have a question for Laura? And people online, if you can submit your questions through the chat, then our wonderful person Dan will relay them. Questions, comments? Dan.
What do you do when you have a problem with rodents in the house? What kind of treatments should you use for that?
Mhm.
Besides the usual
Snap traps. So on our website, Save Arlington Wildlife, we do have like an alternatives to rodenticide page. One thing that we mention, we say that, so there's pest control professionals, but there's also something called a problem animal control agent, which is different. Sometimes you do have a professional who's both, but a lot of times the problem animal control agents are not also pest control professionals, so they don't use poison. They focus entirely on how to find where the rodents are coming from, where they're nesting, where they're getting in the house. So it's all like trapping and exclusion and different kinds of traps, not just the snap traps. So we say that we usually advocate trying to contact one of them instead of a licensed pest control professional, unless again, you can say for sure that they're not going to use rodenticide. There are other things too. There are deterrents that you work in a variety of ways. I know there's one called Fresh Cab, which I think was the first one. It might be the only deterrent that was initially, the EPA endorsed it or approved it. And I know there's been some more since then. I think Magic Mouse is another one where it's these satchels and you can put them in places like closets or under cabinets. There's another one that is like made with kind of pepper spray, cayenne pepper, because it burns them, so they don't like being there. So there's other like sort of do-it-yourself stuff too, but if it's a really big problem or even the do-it-yourself stuff is failing, I would say at least call to consult with a problem animal control agent, because they can think about it comprehensively, or at least do like a home visit and give you maybe an estimate of like where they're coming in and out of, because that's the biggest problem, right? Is the exclusion issue. If they're finding ways into your house, because they're going to keep finding ways into your house. And if you're baiting even a snap trap, that's still food you're leaving out. So you may get some, but some can outsmart it, like I said, or if they see one of their buddies getting it, then they're going to avoid the snap trap. So if you're not combining it with exclusion, you might still get some in waves.
I'd like to add something to that. I do have soil around my house, so they can get through soil, but I did find that increasing the soil level and making sure that things outside the house weren't like good stones that I could find in front of holes that I think they might be using, and it really made a difference. And this sounds awful, but I use an electrocutioner. It's a 4C battery. If they get in my house and I tell them you come in my house, go ahead.
Yeah.
Last year, which is probably 3 to 4 times more than I got the year before.
Mhm.
And I have a very sensitive hearing, so I can usually hear them in the house before I see them. They love peanut butter, and they can be smart too, so they might, it might not work like the first night, but the second, eventually they'll get hungry enough. And I also have all my food in metal or glass containers, they can chew through plastic.
Yes.
So, and I know that when we saw Laura's presentation in Lexington, there was a gentleman there who had other sources, there was another type of trap. That would eliminate, it would kill them, but it wasn't electronic, but it would kill them, and so.
Like
there
a
are-
CO2 trap. So there's
Yeah.
like the electronic ones, there's the CO2 traps where they get trapped in and it asphyxiates them. So there's other types of traps that are a little more sophisticated than the snap traps. Raptors are the solution, which I often partner with, and I have some handouts there from like what to do if you get rats in different areas. Those are all available online on their website, and I also link to it on my page on the alternatives to rodenticide link as well. So there are definitely a lot of other options too. There's even some emerging stuff that's pretty neat. Like there's something called Slick Barrier where you can paint it around. It comes sort of like a paint, but it can come in colors, but I think there's clear too, where you can paint around the base, and it basically makes them slide, like they can't climb up the roof. And it works for other types of pests as well, not just rodents, that I thought, wow, that's pretty neat. And so I've also have like links to that and some other stuff as well. Yes.
I think we found just going over the house with pine trees from every little crack, they can get through something this big.
Yeah.
And push off and nail and seal and
Mhm.
we haven't had one. At one point, I had an outdoor door that just went into the cellar and I fixed the ceiling and I was saying, "Hey, nice."
Yep.
And, that was it. That was one. So ceiling of the cabinet, they can climb anything,
Mhm.
just keep talking and ceiling and.
And they don't like metal, so that's why often they say to stuffed corners, if you're on a budget and you can't afford like a person to come and do formal exclusion, finding those cracks and stuffing it with steel wool. Lining the bottoms of your cabinets like I did with foil, they don't like those metals. Those can also help be a deterrent, can be helpful as well. Yes.
I never had rats till about 4 years ago.
Mhm.
The city of Waltham dug up the sewers on Plimpton Street. And then everybody had rats.
Yep.
And now, so anyways, one of my tenants complained to me, she goes, I can hear them in the trash barrels chewing at night. And
Yeah.
I had no idea that this happened until she told me. So I called the city. Is anybody from the city here?
No.
Nobody from the department that takes care of this here. Okay, great. So anyways, I called the city and I said, what do I do about it? They said, I said, do you come out and do extermination? This is a long time ago. About 4 years ago. And they said, no, but we'll give you the name of, company. So they did. So I called this company. They're based in Georgia. The guys come, they set traps with rodenticide. The rats know after like 1 or 2 times that it's poison.
Yep.
They go in, they eat the peanut butter and leave.
Mhm.
They don't even bother
Mhm.
with and I just noticed at the end of April, the rats have had new families.
Mhm.
And once they got in, it's almost impossible to get them out. So all these guys do is come in and set traps. Oh, it's the other point I want to make. I called on the neighbors next door, my house, and it was the what are they called? The housing authority owns the building next door,
Mhm.
and it was their trash barrels that were open where the rats were getting in.
Mhm.
And they said, and so the guy said to me, well, if you're getting rats, you have to take care of them. I said, well, I hired a company because I called and they said, sorry, he goes, oh, good, then we won't fine you. I said, fine me.
Mhm.
It's your fault. We have rats.
Mhm.
It's not my fault. We have rats. So the other thing is this guy that comes, he's a really nice guy, but he just does what the company says to do. But he says he's constantly reading and constantly watching things. Once rats move in, they don't want to move out.
Mhm.
And it's almost, I have places, I've hired a contractor to come to my house now to actually dig up the yard and
Mhm.
get rid of these nests.
Mhm.
Let's see, what else do I want to tell you? So I said to him, do you have electric traps? And he goes, well, I'll call my manager. Well, I haven't heard back. I'm about to fire them, because I'm gonna do it myself. I actually did some of it myself with, I used, what's that stuff called? Plaster and, hardware cloth. The kind that, you know, the metal
Mhm.
wires, and then I plugged holes with that,
Mhm.
and that worked. And I dig down with a pitchfork, all the holes that I found, and I'm going around doing this myself, and I paid this guy $100 a month to come and get rid of. And but that was the city's solution, the city told me that, so I'm a little PO'd about this. And I'm ready, it's something I never thought I'd say, I'm ready to take up a gun and get a license. Get these animals, because you know.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, the rats are a nuisance.
Yeah.
You can't sit outside in a patio anymore without them showing up.
Yeah. And I mean, that's sort of to my point. I think a lot of the poison is perpetuating the issue because one, it's
You know, the
enabling.
EPA was gutted by Trump. So that's why they have this thing, because they're all pro-business now, and they don't care about welfare.
And I mean, there, even before, like, the EPA that still allowed these to be distributed by, that was in 2015, but it's been a continual problem. The EPA has had a lot of budget cuts, even under the Biden administration. It has not been shored up. And at the end of my article, the investigative feature I wrote in 2021, it was about the EPA and how the division specifically that's supposed to do these risk assessments has been cut significantly. And also how there's been, like, the whistleblowers got fired who were saying that a lot of the chemicals that should not be approved were still getting approved, and then they got fired, the whistleblowers, I believe, and so there was part of that as well. Are there other questions regarding?
One line I'd like to bring up. What about the non-anticoagulants like bromothylin? and
Bromothylin, yeah,
Cholesterol?
yeah,
The
cholesterol.
lockboxes by the pest control company supposedly less chance of secondary poison.
There is less chance of secondary poisoning. So, you know, at Save Arlington Wildlife, we're not going to endorse any rat poison or rodenticide because people take a poison-free pledge. It means they're not using poison. I mean, but we are mostly focused on getting people to stop or regulating the anticoagulant rodenticides, and especially the second generation, but the first generation as well to a lesser extent, but still, because those are the most dangerous ones for working up the food chain. So those are the ones we're emphasizing and focusing on because, you know, we're choosing our battles with our bandwidth, and they are the ones that are killing all these birds of prey in particular. That being said, I am not a huge fan of these other poisons as well. They are very harmful if an animal can get into them for firsthand exposure, no matter the wildlife. And as I've shown, these bait stations are not tamper-proof. So if a wildlife species does get into them and gets into bromothylin is a neurotoxin, they're going to have these horrible neurotoxic effects like seizures and foaming at the mouth. And it's still a pretty cruel way to die. The cholecalciferol, which is basically vitamin D, which sounds so benign, right? But it's a mega dose. And for people who may have dogs that, you know, it is extremely toxic. And there has been, not like this, but there has been a bit of a trend of dogs now getting into these bait stations with the cholesterol and dying across the state. So we don't want to tell people to use another poison and then be like, now my dog died. So we don't really, I would say people to be wary of those as well. I mean, when towns or businesses use them, I'm not going to give them the same kind of pressure that with the anticoagulant rodenticides, but I am saying, can you please consider non-poison alternatives, because these are harmful too. And I do worry that they may have more secondary impacts that we'll become aware of if they become the thing that supplants the SCARs. Like right now, they don't seem to be, but they're also used a lot less. There have been some studies that show that possums for secondary feedings, if they feed on several rodents with the vitamin D, they can also die. And other omnivores, like so raccoons and stuff. So I don't want to cause another problem. So similar to what Rachel Carson says, we really have to just investigate all the facts.
So what about these electrical things that Somerville uses? How expensive are they? How difficult are they to use? You need to get them.
So I think Waltham is considering a pilot for those as well. I heard, and I know Arlington is as well, you know, they have to earmark a budget because I think they are considered pretty efficient because they can kill multiple rodents at once. I don't know the exact budget for it
Them is considering contrapest.
as well.
Yes, no, it's true. I talked to the health department yesterday.
And so, yeah,
We started here at the Walking Common in City Hall, and then getting the money for the whole city in July, they'll be doing all of
because
those.
we actually didn't get that confirmed, but about the electric, you can purchase those on Amazon.
Mhm.
Electric ones you can purchase, that one
You can get down.
Yeah. Yes, you can purchase them on Amazon. They're obviously pricier than Snap Pets, but the idea is you can use them. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's not bad.
Oh, oh, sorry, Lisa.
Tom, Lisa from Waltham. I watched Kay grow up at Monkey Cemetery. It devastated me when that happened. And I've seen all the other wildlife. I'm a vet nurse for over 30 years. I also see the domestic animals being poisoned and the devastation that goes through them. Dogs, just for anybody that has animals, dogs get signs between 3 and 7 days after the ingestion of it. And they love eating that stuff. So, and the cats so much.
Tend to be yummy, so that.
Yeah, the cats don't, they're kind of like, they catch stuff in the house, so a lot of times they don't even know. And then a lot of the cats just come in with the signs, and then, that's how we know. So it happened a real lot. I worked in emergency for 10 years, and it'll break out to see what happens to them, just like the birds and the owls and everything. One question I have for you is I read, this might sound really over the head, but they said citronella around your building and rats and mice don't like citronella.
Yes, that's can be a deterrent. And I mean, that fresh cab, I think, is pine and citronella. I mean, rodent, some of it's really depends on the rat, right? Some can be really deterred and some will be stubborn. And it also, you have to, with the deterrents, you have to keep using them because as soon as they start to fade, they can acclimate, but you want to keep renewing it every, I think, month or two, or else like as it fades, of course, they can start coming back as the potency of those deterrents fade. But citronella is often listed as one.
I just wanted one more thing to say is disposing of this. I looked into that and I found out through Waltham, and you can tell your neighbors and everything, you cannot just throw them out because they're still gonna go in and get that from your rubbish.
Yes.
You have to go in Lexington Minuteman. That's where Waltham goes, and if you go on their website, it's once every 2 weeks. You have to pre-register, but they take all hazards. So if you want to get rid of any of that stuff, that's what you want to do with it.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yes. Oh, can I just get his really quick? Because I pointed to him twice and then I feel bad that I had to keep saying wait.
Thanks. So I was really glad that you began with Rachel Carson, because I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm old enough to remember when DBT was banned. I was, a teenager, and it was a big deal.
Mhm.
And so raptors, especially eagles, were dying off, they were almost gone, they banned DBT, the eagles came back, everybody was so happy. Why do we have to learn the same lesson all over again with these? I don't get it. We went through this once, we saw what happens.
Because it's money. People
Yeah.
think this is, that's it.
And I mean, it is very, Yeah.
This was ancient history.
I mean, the United States does not like other countries like in the EU and Canada, though Canada does also have an issue with this as well. But, there's what's called the precautionary principle, which that a lot of the EU countries and Canada, and I think New Zealand apply this to chemicals, not just like pesticides, but even things in our personal care products, which is the idea that if we don't know for sure its impacts, we want to have precaution. And if it shows any signs, we usually want to, pull the reins and maybe reduce it or, stay on the side of caution and ban it if possible. So they've done that with a bunch of chemicals that we allow here in the United States, from like, the RBST and, milk products, unless it's organic, to other things that are So the United States does this thing where piecemeal, we need to be shown beyond a shadow of a doubt, there's the X amount of impact. Like with this, I often hear, yes, 96% of these raptors have been exposed, but we don't know what the tolerance level is. They may be able to survive, or yes, X amount may, yes, there are ones dying, but those might just be a small percentage. But it's like, well, but we're using more and more of these poisons. So the problem is becomes an aggregate impact. Again, 8 years ago when I first became involved with this, prior to 2015, I never saw a bait box, and I also never saw rats. And then suddenly there were bait boxes being put everywhere. And I remember really struggling with places. I mean, I'm not even going to name names, but calling organizations that should be on this that were like, well, what are you going to do when there's a rat? You're going to use this. And I even said, in a few years, we're going to start seeing all these high profile deaths of wildlife, and we're going to regret where we're going. And I felt like Cassandra, everyone was like, we don't believe you. You're just being like, you're acting like Chicken Little. I mean, I actually got it on my Facebook post the other day, you know, how it reminds you of something. And it was weird that it was the night before this presentation where it was like from like 2015, where I was like, my update was like, I'm speaking to my landlord, desperately trying to get them to like stop using these baits. I think I've almost got them to do it. They didn't do it. They just did it now, 8 years later, now that there's a petition and we have dead bald eagles. But often people need to have the full impacts before they do that. In our country, unfortunately, our public policy reflects that in a lot of ways. And it's unfortunate because I don't want the bald eagles, which are not even completely recovered in Massachusetts. I think it was premature for us to demote them to species of special concern from threatened because we weren't considering the impacts of these poisons. And that took decades for them to recover. I mean, that was banned in 1972, and until 2012, they were still endangered in Massachusetts. So what are we causing when we're doing that? And this time around, we also have climate change to contend with that is also threatening a lot of these species. So we may not get a do-over if we repeat the same mistakes with another chemical.
Extinct forever.
Yeah. Yes.
There have been any case studies from municipalities that have really tackled this problem effectively?
That have, you mean banned or restricted these and had a good impact?
Or controlled the rat population?
Probably not.
Well, I want to say, the thing is, this is not being studied well, right? And we're also dealing with a rat problem. Like I said, our increase in rats is also fairly recent. It just seems like in the past decade, we've had like this explosion in rodent populations in all these metro areas. I do want to say that California has banned escars throughout the state. There's some exemptions for like farms or wineries, but it is banned on most of private property. And Ratmageddon did not happen, as was was fear-mongered by the industry that like, oh, they're going to be swarming with rats. It didn't happen. British Columbia and Canada did a moratorium, and they did, after I think it was a 2-year moratorium, and they did just adopt it this past spring permanently because they said that they noticed no adverse impact. So there was no severe increase in the rodent population, and also there was no adverse economic impact. So they adopted it permanently, that moratorium. So there are case studies of places banning rodenticide, I will say, and it's not like, oh my God, we're having such a problem with rat apocalypse, we have to go back. And they haven't noticed any adverse economic impacts. And I mean, there's been a lot of ContraPest studies, like Somerville did that study, and it was a 57 to 67% reduction. And so there have been studies of specific pilots, like of ContraPest and other options. Yes, Eric. I know there's also an online question I have to get to soon.
But I want to second what you said about the disposal at first, because I was curious about that too. Like, it's a mysterious black box how they disposed of.
Mhm.
And I actually called a province in Canada that has a service for farms to get rid of it. And they said, oh yeah, we just throw them in incinerators. But the problem is when you incinerate them, as Laura showed, and this is something that a lot of people don't know, when you incinerate it, it just puts it into the air.
Yeah.
I don't think they're taking that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We even think there's a lot of incinerators around.
Yeah. It must be a special incinerator. It has to
For escars, yeah,
It's very expensive.
Yep.
And there are obviously risks and costs associated with that for every box.
So that,
That's out there.
so that's something that also, you know, that I think about too, is the waste issue. They're bringing all these plastic boxes with this waste that can't be recycled. This plastic can't be recycled or reused in an easy way because, right, it has this waste. A lot of times these bait stations are abandoned by whatever contract pest company. I have so many people who say when the contract ended, they wouldn't come get the bait station. So they're just lying around and they may still have residue. Some of them are being placed. I've seen it here in Waltham and I've seen it in other areas right near the river, where if there's a flood that's going in and that may have some effects. And as to the incineration issue, I mean, I don't even know for sure, but I know this is an issue with other toxic waste. Those incinerators are usually located near low-income communities, often low-income communities of color. So again, that's externalizing the public health risks for this poison at the end of its life as well, wherever it's going, as well as the other stuff we're using. So we are, when I see all these boxes, it also makes me shudder. Where is it going to go at the end of its life cycle as well? If it's not winding up in the body of an animal it's killing, and those usually also have to be incinerated at times, what's happening? So thanks for bringing that up. I know there was another question you said online.
What about, rat birth control products like Newton is doing?
Yes, that's the ContraPest. So I mentioned that it briefly during the Somerville part of the slide, like they did a pilot of ContraPest back, I think in 2016 or 17, and for a year or two, and they found a 57 to 67% reduction in the rat populations of those sites. Yes, and I know Newton is doing that. Arlington, I think, is also looking into that, and you said Waltham is looking into that as well.
Yeah. I'd love to tell you guys about what Waltham is doing, and the members of our Save Waltham Wildlife can chime in, but the Economic and Community Development Committee has a resolution that Councilor Callahan Harris put forth that asks or, yes, suggests that the use of SCARs be banned from all city properties. They also recommend adding ContraPest to the bait traps. And I want to clarify, not every black box that you see.
No, yeah, it does not
has
have that.
poison. Only the ones that have the white stickers on them.
Though there is a problem where many are not properly labeled. We've run into that too, where they're either not labeled or they are like, they get weathered off. But yes, some of them have other types of the other baits we've discussed, either the other rodenticides or ContraPest or snap traps, because they do have to also be in bait stations. So obviously a kid or non-target animal can't get injured.
So prior to this resolution, we were told that only on the school properties is where they were not using the bait traps that have the SCAR, but on other properties they were. So the resolution asks for SCARs to be forbidden from all city properties, and adding the ContraPest to the bait traps that exist, and then yes,
It's city buildings,
city buildings.
which is not all city properties. I take that as a little loophole.
I think that's correct, and something that we want to see strengthened, changed. We have lots of suggestions for these first steps, which we're pleased that the city has taken, but we feel that they can go stronger. Another suggestion that was forwarded to the mayor was the establishment of another staff position in the Consolidated Public Works Department. And this person would be fining folks for not having their garbage in hard containers. And I think if you put it out too early. So that's a lot of money. Something else that has been talked about that we strongly feel that the city should do is pay for and supply the closed trash cans that have a latch on them that frankly every other municipality has provided to their residents. That was discussed at the Economic Redevelopment Committee meeting, and it was a high price. Was the concern, and it seems like it was felt that the price of adding a staff person that was more important than providing trash cans to everyone. So we feel that it's imperative that the city look for grants and look for other ways to provide these lidded receptacles to all residents and landlords, because it's a big problem for people who are tenants, this, that, and the other, and others who can't afford to buy these hard containers. So that's a big thing that we are encouraging you to encourage your city councilor. That recommendation did go to the mayor's office. The mayor did share that they will be banning the use of eScars in all city buildings. We said, what about the housing authority? And she explained that that's actually a state
That's
thing,
its own thing.
but she entertained the idea of bringing that up to them. So we would like to follow up with that.
We did a letter to our housing authority well, also the bald eagle nest is right next to one of their properties. So when C-25 died, there was an open letter brought by one of our groups to the AHA asking them to phase out, and they did respond, and they phased it out on all of their properties immediately. They still had it on their family properties for another year or so, which we were disappointed because again, children are another risk, but they did do it on all their properties, and now they have no more AR poisons anywhere. So the housing authorities are another place. They have an elected board, so they're influential. You can influence them during election season. You can make this a wedge issue, like, please,
And we are in election season right now. So we encourage you to check with your city councilors, your at-large reps, and the mayoral candidates and ask for their thoughts. I did want to say one other thing about the city, and that is we are disappointed that the city has hired a law firm to represent them to push back against the conditions of approval that the Waltham Conservation Commission put towards the recreation department and their Fernald property development. Big development there, lots of things going on. But the Conservation Commission asked that the recreation department tell the Conservation Commission where they're putting the poison all around in the Fernald property. And they want to know, first of all, the Conservation Commission said you can't use poison in the areas where we have jurisdiction, which is around the wetlands. But for the rest of the property, the Conservation Commission said that we would like to know where you're placing the poison, and so we can track it, which is part of that other important law that we all feel should be pushed forward. So that was the condition of approval, and the city is pushing back on that. So they are doing
a lot of other things in that.
Yeah, there are many conditions, but pertinent to this issue. So that is very disappointing, and something that was a major letdown, because we thought this was great, that here's the Conservation Commission putting this requirement, condition of approval, and we wanted that to be like a standard condition of approval, and I think they did too. So that's something that we're not happy about.
One of those face down dead great horned owls was on Colonel property.
Right, absolutely, that people saw on the site visit.
Yeah.
That's one thing back on the trash. I mean, I think this is huge, that they would, want to counter a recommendation from their own city people about that putting eScars in the conservation land, but we have no big belly canisters. Am I correct? Is anybody seeing any?
Actually, I have the next door.
In the city,
It seems to be at Waltham, it's with the Waltham housing that I live next to.
That's
not-
so I think that'd be
It's
another,
not-
could be something else that we might be thinking of. Moody Street is full of food trash. And there's not one big belly, one secure receptacle anywhere.
Not only that, but they took away regular receptacles where there were some before, because as I said, I've been cleaning the river for 17 years. And there was one at the crosswalk of Moody where you cross over, and it's gone.
Is that
one right by the river?
Yes.
It's right on, yes, there's a barber shop there with the trains, near the train tracks. So there was one there and it's gone, and I don't know why it's gone. It hasn't been replaced. I spoke to Sonia about it. We thought, well, maybe they're testing it and they're gonna replace it with something different, but they did not. It's totally gone. And I know people are actually using boxes to put litter in because
they wanna put it somewhere. And there's nothing to put it in, so they're actually using, and they're doing it this themselves, they're putting it in boxes just so that it's all contained in one
Right,
receptacle, even though it's ineffective.
right. Okay, gang, so it is 3:47, and this is supposed to end at 3:30. So if you want to be more involved with the Save Waltham Wildlife campaign, please put your email address on this. And Alan or Linda or Leslie or Emily will get in touch with you so that we can clarify and further strengthen how we would like you to advocate, so that we can get rid of this terrible poison that is damaging and killing our wildlife and hurting our pets and hurting our families.
And we'll send you lots of information.
And you can also just go to, so if where you see Save Arlington Wildlife, all one word. If you email Save Waltham Wildlife, all one word like that, at gmail.com, you can sign up that way.
And I do want to just say again, really quickly, that rally, like I said, the Committee of Natural Resources and Environment is hearing all of those rodenticide bills this upcoming Wednesday, May 10th. So I know it's a work day, but if people are free and want to have a great fun day, like we're meeting at noon in front of the State House. The hearing starts at 1 if people do want to go in and testify, or even to just be there with signs or shirts. They said is a very powerful thing, even if you're not speaking. And you can get you can write the committee your testimony. It doesn't have to be by that day. Usually it takes them a few weeks to deliberate, though you probably want to get it in within a week or two of the hearing. And you can also attend, like I said, online if you can't make it in person, but we would love to get as much of I know we're not going to get what we got when MK died that day with hundreds of people, but even if we got 70 or 80 or 60 people there that day, I think it would make a really big impression for the legislators that this really matters. And if you can't, please write the committee and please write your legislators asking them to co-sponsor those bills. And it's all on our website, the Save Arlington Wildlife website, all about those bills.
Instagram, etc. The same Arlington Wildlife.
We do not have an Instagram. I'm kind of a Luddite, so it's even a lot for me to have a website. So we have Save Arlington Wildlife, but we do have a Facebook page. So I am at least that clued in that I have a Facebook page. So if you go to Save Arlington Wildlife on Facebook, we're also updating, and we do have an event page for this rally as well.